You said that you think one of the biggest issues facing men today is the issue of suicide. And you talked about some of the stats at the
Mm.
top of this conversation that relate to men. The most startling of all, as being someone that lives most of the time in the UK, is that it's now the biggest killer of men under the age of 45. Um, have you been exposed to those stories, especially as you published this book, but in your own personal life, have you been exposed to those stories of the impact of suicide directly?
Yeah. Yeah, people rarely talk about it in an open forum, but they will very often afterwards talk about it. And I had this moment recently, someone I'm actually working with, and I've been working with for some time. I did a little piece on Morning Joe, which is a daytime thing in the US. And I talked about this crisis of kind of male suicide. And she told me afterwards that they put up just a stat that 4 times higher among men. It was just a graphic. And she said she burst into tears. And she said, "I'm so grateful you're doing this work. I lost my son to suicide when he was 16." And started telling me kind of why. And I have worked with this woman for years on this issue. And she'd never raised it with me before. I had no idea. And I now understand why, particularly given her situation, she's been so supportive of my work. It wasn't just an intellectual thing. This is very rarely just an intellectual thing. It's usually visceral as well. There's usually something going on there. And I've had countless stories like that. People sharing their stories, and it's heartbreaking. And you've had people on this show who've talked quite a lot about this. Jordan Peterson was asked in an event once by this guy. He said, I delayed my suicide to come and hear you talk. Why should I not take my own life? No, I haven't had anything like that. But it's there. This crisis is there in our communities playing out.
I'm just thinking about that woman who's been working with you, supporting your work, but hadn't said anything. And I'm wondering why people don't say something about it when it happens in their family. With other deaths, with a cancer death, you'll see a Facebook post, you'll see
Yes.
a whatever, you'll see, but it seems, I'm wondering here if there's a different level of, I don't know, public sharing as it relates to suicide, because it's a
Yeah.
different type of death, isn't it? It's one
Yes.
that creates a lot of guilt and feelings
Guilt and shame. And so you're in her situation. And I have to tell you, having raised boys, one of whom in particular really struggled with his mental health through teen years, there are days where you just hope as a parent that they're still around. And you think, what it was, and actually at 16, and we've seen a huge rise in young men's suicides in the US, especially. And you just think, if you're a parent and you lose a child to suicide, the idea that you cannot free yourself of the burden of what could I have done? What did I miss? Was it me? Right? Being a parent is already a lifelong trip in rethinking your decisions, right? And you add that to the mix. I can't imagine it. I mean, my parents lost a daughter very young to a heart defect, and they have an amazing marriage, and they've been amazing parents. But I do think that the loss to this illness, this terrible tragedy thing, it's just different. It's hugely grief, but it doesn't turn them, like, it turns the mirror on you. It's like, was this you? Was this your fault? Are you the reason your son is dead? Just think about that for a moment and what that kind of does to people. And so because of that, people don't talk about it. So you'll get died unexpectedly.
Yeah.
We're not willing to talk about it in the same way as we are others, because we think it might reflect on us in some way, perhaps, or on the memory of that person.
Or them, yeah.
I mean, it's still a crime, technically.
Oh, is it?
Now, people say, it's a really interesting thing I've really learned not to say commit suicide.
Yeah. Died by suicide.
Died by suicide.
I just wanted to, because
Sure.
I've got some crazy unthinkable stats here that I wanted to just add on top of what you were saying, which come from the Institute of Boys and Men report. That really was staggering to me, is that a man dies by suicide approximately every 13 minutes.
In the US, yes.
In the United States alone. So that's not including other countries and the UK.
Just the US.
Okay. If men's suicide rates had matched those of women's, approximately 545,000 fewer men would have died since 1999. And that's again just in the US.
Just US. 500,000 men, yeah.
suicide rates amongst younger men have grown the fastest. The growth of male suicides has occurred almost entirely since the beginning of 2010s.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly as well, rural countries in the USA have higher rates of suicide than those in urban metros. So it highlights again that suicidality is geographically distributed in certain ways. Why? What's going on here? What's going on with this full picture? Why is this the state of suicide amongst men?
In some ways, the decision to end your own life, obviously it's complex and it varies, but in some ways it's like the ultimate signal that you don't feel as if the world is better off with you than without you. Like, so many people who take their own lives, lose their lives to suicide, will say something like, "You'll be better off without me. I've been a burden to you. I know I've been difficult." They convince themselves that they're not wanted, they're not needed. In some ways, that goes back to like Arthur Miller's play Death of a Salesman. Willie Loman takes his own life because he thinks that the life insurance his family will get will be a better breadwinner than he can be, because he's so badly failed in his primary responsibility as a breadwinner. So it's not a new idea, but there's a really nice piece of work by Fiona Shand. She's an Australian researcher, and the work was done primarily in Australia, where they looked at the words that men who did take their own lives used to describe themselves before doing so, or in some cases attempting to, but usually when men attempt suicide, they do lose their lives. And the two most commonly used words by those men who took their own lives were about themselves were useless and worthless. Now, of course, this is a sample of people who then went on to take their own lives, but it's nonetheless, I think, very powerful statement that to get to that stage, you don't think you have worth. You don't think you have use. You don't think you're needed. And I believe that the most fatal place to end up in as a human being is to feel unneeded. I think to be needed is arguably the most important and constant human requirement. And so if you end up feeling like I'm not needed, I mean, my family don't need me, my employer doesn't need me, my community doesn't need me, I am surplus to requirements. If anything, I'm a drag on my parents or on my community. I'm not adding value, however you define value, to the people around me. I'm taking away from it. That's the psychological trajectory that seems to put a lot of men towards this path. And well short of suicide, I think many of the other mental health problems we see among men, addiction, checking out in one way or another, coming out of the labor market, etc., they're not the most extreme form, of course, of checking out by literally taking your own life, but they are a different form of that. They are a different way of kind of benching yourself, taking yourself out of the equation because of a sense of like, well, who needs me anyway, right? And so I just think in a way that the suicide statistics are in some ways the kind of tip of the iceberg of this sense that many men have of feeling unneeded.